Gregory, it's been extraordinary to host him and his work at the museum. If you follow Netflix, he recently did the artwork for The Ballad of Buster Scruggs, which is a quite popular movie. Greg's peers just voted you the #1 fantasy illustrator in the world for 2018. So I don't think I need to say anything else. We're delighted to have you here, and thank you and welcome.
Thanks, Mary. Hey, afternoon. Thanks for coming. Well, it's Adventure Week, the end of Adventure Week at the Rockwell Museum, and part of that adventure for me has been becoming an artist over my many decades of life now. And I didn't expect to take a look at painting and drawing as an adventure. When I started out, I just thought of it as a career. And when I started in art school, I was kind of told that those careers were over, that nobody does those anymore, and nobody oil paints anymore, and nobody basically draws and paints anymore. So my first day at art school was not a good one for me, because I wanted to draw and paint, and I wanted to learn how to draw and paint, because I figured learning to draw and paint could not be based on a gift, not talent, because I knew pretty surely I didn't have any of that. It didn't show up in my sleep. I didn't wake up one day and go, oh wow, look at this, I can control a pencil. It never worked like that. As a matter of fact, my first few adventures into oil painting were miserable, and I was no good at it, and I had to learn. So I figured if I learned step by step, I could get to a point where I looked like I had talent, and then no one would care anymore, and they'd be faked out into thinking I could do this. So that was my first adventure. And I started to realize that all of it is an adventure. Your entire life is an adventure. It depends on how you look at it. We don't have to be going to the North Pole. We don't have to be going to the South Pole. We don't have to be going to the jungle to be on an adventure. And once I started to see that in my life, I started to actually understand that, oh, people have said you only have to travel as far as your backyard to be on adventure. And some people I know didn't grow up with backyards, so where were they going to go? I did grow up with an immense backyard, about 1.5 acres, and everything occurred in that yard to my imagination. And I think that's where I built the idea of wanting to take my life further with my artwork. I wanted to apply it to many different angles, so to speak, in the business. Most of illustration, usually the thinking is you get a style and you milk that all your life. So that's you, that's it. And I didn't want to be put in that box, because my yard wasn't like that. My yard could be anything. It could be the jungle, could be science fiction, could be any place I wanted it to be, outer space or whatever. So that was my first impression, is don't limit myself to where I could go with my own personal adventures, and I brought that into my illustration life. And then I had a very strong feeling of not taking no for an answer. When people said I couldn't do something, it just more or less irritated me, and I tried to do it anyway. I'm not talking about skydiving or scuba diving or anything like that, but when they told me I couldn't draw certain things, I thought that was ridiculous. So I went against that. Timberline came out of all that adventure. Along the way, high school became an adventure to me, college became an adventure, and becoming a freelance illustrator was an adventure. I studied the martial art for a whole bunch of years. I studied a very obscure martial art called ninjutsu. You may have heard of that. It's the guys with the masks. And we actually wore the masks, and we did the whole black thing, and we went out at night, and we did secret ops, and we learned all kinds of stuff like that. And I got to go to Japan and study with a grandmaster that was a descendant of the actual ninja from the 16th century. That martial art went back about 1,000 years, and we've traced how it got its start, went into India, then was brought over into China and down into Japan. And I got to go to Japan for about 3 weeks, train with these guys in the mountains, doing all kinds of martial arts tricks and doing things with weird weapons and all that kind of stuff. We did a lot of climbs, some mountain pathways where we couldn't really read the signs. It was all in kanji, so I didn't know Japanese and I couldn't read it. But some of it was black and some of it was red. But we managed to get beyond the red kanji and found our way to the top of these mountains and stuff. It was pretty dangerous up there. They had chain links along the trail so you could hold on to it because the drop-off was pretty severe. We couldn't see the drop-off because clouds had set in, so it was all foggy. So we never knew if we got to the top or not. But my time over there in Japan, learning how to become a better ninja, was something that I applied to my artwork, not necessarily to the martial arts. I met a lot of different people, and adventuring would seem to be why they were there as well. And the discoveries we made were not something that were earth-shattering, but they were unique. We would spend time at the graveyard of the samurai at midnight doing all kinds of weird invisible techniques and stuff like that. The ninja were incredibly happy people, even though they were very oppressed by the samurai. Something we don't really get the history of a lot in America when they're doing movies like American Ninja and guys are flipping around and turning invisible and stuff like that. There's a lot of practicality to all those martial arts that came from some problems that they ran into. And I loved hearing about those problems and finding out how they solved those problems. And they were always very practical steps. The ninja loved theater, they loved singing, they loved dancing. A very spirited group, but very small and clandestine because they were hunted down by the samurai a lot during that time. But if you're training around ninja today, students of ninjutsu today, they're a unique group and quite friendly, not like the typical martial arts. We never key-eyed or we didn't go screaming and flipping around a lot. We were very quiet. I brought all that into my artwork, and I realized that practicality made a lot of sense when it got to drawing. And Patrick and I are going to draw at 3 o'clock. We're going to show you how to do a polar bear if you want to come join us. Pretty easy. A couple of black eyes, big black nose. You're halfway there. Anyway, so after martial arts, I was still freelancing as an illustrator, and I got a call from National Geographic. Basically, my agent and I were working on a painting together as an advertisement in a catalog of illustration to serve clients that were looking for certain looks. And I did a painting of some guys in Africa on expedition, exploring, and he didn't like it. My agent didn't like the picture because he said, "Who are we going to sell this to, National Geographic?" And I said, well, that might be nice, actually, if we could do that. First phone call, National Geographic. I didn't have to say much to my agent. He was right in on that. So I did a battle scene for them of the CSS Alabama. And if you're an illustrator, you ever work with National Geographic, they assign you a research team, and you are there working on this thing for about a year. And the CSS Alabama was a Confederate raiding ship and got into its final battle in 1863 off the shores of France, and they didn't do so well. They lost that battle, but I had to go over with the research team detail after detail on this ship. One of the details was all the rigging up around the crow's nest. I spent 2 hours with one of the researchers in Washington, D.C., learning where all those ropes go. And it was great, but at the end, when I was doing the painting, I managed to paint smoke right across all that stuff, so I didn't have to paint all that rigging. There was a lot more I had to learn. I could tell you a lot about that ship that, it's just didn't get into the painting at all. That started my relationship with National Geographic. I did one other painting for them for another article, and then they called and said, hey, we are doing a story on David Thompson, a guy who mapped Canada back in the 1700s. And he actually traveled 80,000 miles in his life. He came from London as a 26-year-old guy. He was about my size. And I used me to model for him, because it's easier to pose yourself than to go hire models. But I was similar to this guy. He broke his leg as soon as he got here to the United States. He was trying to get up to Canada, working with the Hudson Bay Company, and he sat in a cot for 6 months while his leg was healing, and he always walked with a limp after that throughout his life. But this guy was amazing. He had a sextant and other supplies when he was traveling in canoes, and he kept taking readings all the time during this expedition that he went on constantly all throughout Canada. They found that his readings were so accurate that even by satellite now, they were never more than maybe 3 meters off. And that was in the 1700s. That's dedication for you. So a writer wanted to write about this guy, and they wanted an illustrator to illustrate some of the moments in his life that were important. So they asked if I would go on a canoe trip down this one particular river that he had a major problem with in the 1700s, almost died. And I said, sure, why not? So I didn't believe that was going to happen, but I found myself going on expedition with National Geographic, which is nerve-wracking in itself, because I thought, oh, I've never done this before, but I will act like the ninja about this. And so basically what I thought I'd do today is show you what happened on that trip. Just moments along the way. I was given a couple cameras from National Geographic to carry with me. They wanted me to record things and then sketch along the way. We were going down, we were avoiding class 5 and 6 rapids while we were in a canoe. I'm paddling away. There's no time to draw. I picked up the camera every now and then and took some shots. That was about it. But we portaged around a lot of stuff. I'll talk about that. But basically, if any of you go on an expedition with National Geographic, and you ask them for camera equipment, they say, yeah, what do you want? Because they have it all. And so I went to National Geographic, to their camera department, and I picked out some of the most expensive stuff I could think of, and carried these 2 cameras with me in a pouch along the way. One of them came apart along the 8-hour van ride as we went up to Saskatchewan, Canada. This river is way up north towards the Northwest Territories, called the Fond du Lac River. Makes a big S-curve. And we were driving up along the way to get to the float plane. We were going up and down hills, and I was cleaning the camera to make sure everything was working right. And the entire section, there's an advance arm. This was back when we had film. The entire advance arm came apart and floated in front of me as we went up weightless over a hill. All the parts separated in the air. And I looked at it and thought, well, that can't be right. And so I just put my hand over the top, and we came down, and I slammed them all back in the camera, and it still worked. It was the strangest thing ever. I just thought I'd tell that because it's really weird. But anyway, so this is a float plane. When we were attaching the canoes to the bottom of the plane to fly in, we went about an hour farther north from where we had the float plane. I went from jet planes to prop planes, and then the truck, and now the float plane. The first time I'd been on a float plane, there were two planes going in. There were 6 of us, and we had 3 canoes. And here's where we put in at Potato Lake. That just came back. I was trying to remember that for weeks. We put in, and they dumped our canoes off, and we put all of our equipment in there. And at that point, we were completely cut off from civilization. We didn't have GPS, we didn't have cell phones, we didn't have radios, we didn't have anything. Unfortunately, the guys packed decaf coffee. So everybody that was a coffee drinker on a trip had massive headaches by about 2 days in. We managed to find a cabin up there, which is out in the middle of nowhere, and we looked in the window and found that they had coffee in there. So we broke into the cabin, fixed a pot of coffee immediately while we were writing the "I am sorry" note that National Geographic would send them a pound of coffee at some point. Like I said, we were up there with nobody. First people we saw on the river as we started out that day were from Alabama on a fishing trip. I thought, well, this is not nowhere. Basically, here we are with all of our gear that we kept in barrels to keep them dry, not like David Thompson. David Thompson didn't even wear his pants in the canoe. They were all in leather, and they kept all their equipment loose in the canoe. They paddled without their pants because they were constantly getting wet. They also kneeled in the canoe, and their paddles were only about that wide and about this long, then with the handle on it. And they paddled very quickly, like this. We were paddling slowly. And I'm not sure why they paddled like that, but that's how they did it in the 1700s. This was basically the guy that knew the river. He's checking his maps and stuff. And I got to ride with him. He was the #1 canoeist in Canada that year and had been for several years. This guy could drive a canoe. I barely had to work at it. I was the navigator in the bow, but he was the guy driving this thing. I almost took a few times to draw along the way because he was totally in control. But this was our young 21-year-old Native American guide, Leon. Leon was in my tent, and we did not get along at first, which was a bit challenging. And we found a way to get along a few days later, and it was great. We got very close along the way. It was excellent. I gave him an eagle feather, which he put in his hat. I found it because we were crawling up this tree into the eagle's nest, and no, I found it at the bottom of the eagle's nest. They're everywhere if you look at the bottom of an eagle's nest. But he really enjoyed that. He was a great canoeist as well. Here we are just stopping off. This is a little bit of the environment we were in. It was overcast a lot, rained a ton. We were up there for 2 weeks. And had anything happened along the way, there was no way to get a message out. We would have to go down the river. Every now and then a float plane went by that carrying firefighters, because there were fires that were burning at the time up there. As a matter of fact, the fire started up about the distance of where that island is in that shot. One night when we were just setting up camp, and a fire started in the forest and burned itself out by morning. We thought maybe the float planes would come in, but they didn't. The person standing in the bow of the canoe there, which is not a good technique when you're in a canoe, but that's Maria Stenzel, and she was a National Geographic photographer. And she took so many rolls of film, 120 rolls of film, just unheard of at the time. I took 20 rolls of film. This is us just on the river at a wide spot. And I thought I'd just show a few of the conditions we were under when it did get nice. This was in August. And like I say, 2 weeks up there, and about the middle of August, temperatures were in the 70s during the day. At night, it dropped into the 40s and 30s sometimes. Some days you could wake up in the morning and see wolf prints around the campsite, which was a little daunting. We did see a couple black bear up there, and my canoe mate, Leon, took us right over to go see them. He wanted to paddle right up close to them. Luckily, they ran away. I was the only guy that saw a moose in the canoe, because I was in the bow in the first canoe. Around the corner, there was a moose standing in the river, and I said, "Oh my God, moose!" which scared it off into the woods, and nobody else saw it, so they never believed me. This is a little bit more what the landscape's like up there. The scrub pines and rough bluffs along the river. Sometimes very shallow. That last shot was maybe a foot deep. And other times you couldn't see the bottom. The amazing thing up there is the water. It was all crystal clear. You could see straight to the bottom everywhere, and you could drink right straight from the water. Just dip your cup in and drink. And it was the best water I'd ever had in my life. It was amazing. Leon liked to fish, so he was catching pike every now and then. And the guys were getting better at that. I never did any fishing because I was drawing half the time. And they got better and got bigger fish after a while. We were inundated by mosquitoes and black flies most of the time. I came home with 300 to 400 black fly and mosquito bites. That was no fun. I don't know if anybody's ever experienced black flies. Yeah, you can't feel them. And they have something in their saliva that deadens the wound as they're chewing on your ear. It's bizarre. Anyway, this is a couple of walleye. This is the best fish I ever had in my life, and I had to take a picture of it. So this is what it looks like if you ever see this great walleye. Leon made that along the way. The whole place up there is covered in moss, and it's covered in wonderful colors. But have you guys ever seen blue moss? I've never seen, have you? Lichen, yeah. Well, it's about this deep. You can sleep on it, and it covers everything. But this was amazing, amazing stuff. Just beautiful things up there. 5 and 6 class rapids, we did not get to go down that, thankfully. We had to portage around places like this. And here it is a little bit more up close. So we weren't too excited about taking any risks. And David Thompson would also portage around these falls as well. Here we are, having just gotten around it and get ready to put in again. This is the spot where David Thompson actually had his worst accident. He was trying to, what they call line the canoes along some of these falls. So he had 2 Native Americans with him who would run a rope out to the bow of the canoe and guide it down the river while he was in the canoe himself. They got to a point next to some trees, and they argued about whether to go one side of the tree or the other, which to me is not really a necessary argument to have while David Thompson was out in the falls and the canoe was getting ready to tip. And he managed to, this is a little bit closer shot of the area where he is likely to have gone over the falls. He was trying to right the canoe. This is the example of the illustration I did when I got back home of that moment. There's the 2 natives on the side and Thompson in the bow of the canoe with the rear of the canoe coming around ahead, and he's paddling frantically to bring the bow around. And just as he brought the bow around, he made it over the falls and then tumbled anyway. So all the equipment went down river, and they spent the next couple of days retrieving all their stuff. Luckily, he retrieved the sextant so he could keep taking readings. This is basically what the entire article looked like. I'll have some more of these later. This was the most critical spot on the river. This is a rapids that goes in between some rocks on the top right, makes a sharp left-hand turn, and then makes another sharp right-hand turn. This thing was a killer angle on the river, and there's no way we could get through that. So we took the canoes out at the top, and I took some shots. And the National Geographic photographer put on a wetsuit and with a line attached, and she went down into that roiling water to take underwater shots. She just was curious, and while we're all holding on to her with a rope. She was quite the photographer. Here we are trying to figure out how she's going to get in the water. And that's how massive that thing was at the time. Here it is at 4:30 in the morning when she woke me up and said, "Ooh, the light is really nice on the waterfall." So I got up and took shots as well. And this is basically how it came out in the magazine. She was there at the, we were both there on the edge taking the same shot. So I felt like I took that for the magazine, but not quite. Then morning was a little bit later on. We were preparing and trying to figure out our way out of this thing. And we were just going to have to put in and paddle like crazy to get through some of this. Then the sun came out and we could see a pathway down through this section, and that was a fun ride getting through there, but we did okay. We came through it. And then we discovered toward the end of the trip this island of dogs. And they were the coolest dogs ever that I had seen. The whole island was full of them. Apparently the Native Americans would put their sled dogs out there during the summer and come and feed them and stuff. And then in the winter, when the river would freeze over, then the dogs would come to the camps. But these guys were extremely sweet. That's me with my tiny little feather that Leon gave me. And maybe I wasn't native enough or something like that. I don't know. But I wanted to take this little guy home with me, but he wasn't allowed to go with us. The morning of the last day, we were taking shots of Leon out in the fog with the sun coming up. And it just felt like a wonderful trip. Nobody got injured. I cut my finger. That was about it. The rest of this trip was magnificent. We were on a place called Black Lake near an Indian village up there, a Native American village up there, that had just had their first student return from college to come back and teach at their high school. And it was quite a special day for them. They were loving that. So here we are with the canoes, and I was running around taking, National Geographic pictures of cobwebs in the dew and stuff, which would never show up in the magazine. But so the morning came on very bright and wonderful, and then by the end of the day, the float planes were back, and it was overcast again, and we were cutting across the lake to meet the plane. And this is what the watercolors look like that I did for the actual article. It's called David Thompson, the Man Who Measured Canada. And this is an event they had during that time where one of the horses went nuts and threatened to kill some of their party. This is David Thompson in the front and his Native American bride at the time. A lot of these voyagers would have Native American wives, and they would abandon them after a time and go back to wherever they came from. A lot of these guys were from England. But David Thompson never left his Native American wife and stayed with her throughout his life. This was an example of capturing beaver skins and stuff for the Hudson Bay Company. Just so you know, I got this wrong. They actually are on circular loops or hoops to dry out the beaver skins, and we didn't have that information. But boy, did we have that information when the article came out. Got a lot of letters on that, and who did they point to get it wrong? Moi. So Those artists, man, they can't get anything right. Here he is taking a reading at night off the moon with his native guides and some of the people on his trip. And when they had to cut across the Athabasca Pass during the winter one time, there was nothing they could do but build their own snowshoes and hoof it on foot. So they had that in the article as well. One more. And that is the end of that trip with National Geographic. That's me, a little bit younger. So, any questions?
How did National Geo respond once the loop was...
Oh, they reprint some of the letters in the next issue, and then they write how terrible the artist was, that he got that wrong. No, they apologize and say, oh, you're right, you know, it's a circular thing, it's the one thing we got wrong, give us some credit for getting everything else right. No, they're pretty polite.
I'm surprised they didn't make you redo it.
Oh, it was too late. The magazine was already printed and out, yeah. It was irritating. It was irritating to me because we were working really tight. I mean, with all the researchers and everything, we thought we had all the details right. I mean, everything in those watercolors is correct. All the little equipment and all what they were wearing and how they kept their hair and all that sort of thing. Pretty fascinating. National Geographic is phenomenally accurate when you work with them. I did a article on the ancient Scythians, who were sort of the bad boys of the steppes, I guess, way back when. And they used to get their butts kicked all the time by hordes of people coming through, and they would stomp on the Scythians all the time until the Scythians said, all right, okay, we're stopping that. We're going to become the worst guys ever to deal with. And they did. They used to wear the skins of their enemies on their horses that they flayed after killing them. And when they went into battle, they would send battle dogs into camps to rip people apart before they came in, and then took skulls and took the tops off the skulls so they could drink out of the skull. And it was, you know, if you read about the Scythians, they were just brutal. But I had a conversation with a couple Russian folks in D.C. about the details of their socks that they wore. And I thought, you know, if they're going this far with socks, what is this job going to be like? Well, it was an incredible experience as well. I got to learn a lot about their burial mounds. They would bury these guys with all their ritual garb and things, and it's pretty fascinating to understand their history and their culture, even though they were pretty mean. But, you know, I guess you got to cut them some slack for that. So, yeah. I also did some work with Geographic on the black pharaohs that came up from Nubia and overtook Karnak, and the battle that they had there, and building their own form of pyramids, which were very much smaller and kind of pointy. Very bizarre, interesting work. And sometimes when you work with Geographic, the researchers in the field are still bringing in information while you're working on the sketches. So in that particular sketch of the Black Pharaohs article, I had to change the front gate at, I'm sorry, it wasn't Karnak, it was another one. I have to think of that. There was a gate that had one statue in front of it, about 30 feet high. I've been led to believe it was 100 feet high. We had to change that. Then it became much smaller. Then it became 2 statues. And after I had the painting painted, they found out that it was 4 statues. I had to go back in and paint all 4 statues in the painting again. It's just before press time. How does the traveling inspire my art? The thing about that they're finding a lot these days with neuroscience is that travel actually very good for the brain because it's about experiencing the things that you don't expect to experience and forces the brain to deal with it, in a sense, to understand how to take what you already know and shift and change that. That's why languages are particularly good for the brain, because it's constantly trying to compare back and forth, and that comparison is supposed to be pretty great. The students I teach online, I try to get them to understand that A, forget about talent, B, forget about your muse, because if she shows up, she's pretty drunk and pissed off anyway. She's not going to give any help. And basically, it's about the process of learning and making mistakes. So when we travel, we make mistakes all the time, and hopefully it's good mistakes, because a lot of times we're on vacation, but if you're traveling like with geographic, it's all fact-finding all along the way, and it's problem-solving along the way. So we had some trouble on the canoe trip, but like with the coffee, and everybody's got hangovers, and we had to figure out. So we got lucky on that and found a cabin that had coffee in it. That wasn't too hard to figure out, but the brain loves to work on that stuff. Of course, ours loved the caffeine after that. So but the inspiration comes from the challenge all the time. So a lot of times I'll get a call for work, and the idea with illustration is if they could photograph it, they probably would use that. Because we've gotten away from the day when they wanted to use illustration just because illustration was so cool. The camera records these things, and a lot of people think that if it's shot by a camera, it must be real. Actually, I would argue that the illustrator's approach is possibly a little more real than the camera because of what they bring to it and what the team brings to the illustration, as opposed to the camera being very isolated and cold and only recording information that we think is the way it looks. Actually, the camera records all the details, but we only see what we're looking at. So when I look back at the person who asked the question, I really only see you. Everything around is slightly blurred out. And if you go to check on it, I can't, because that section becomes clear, and then that section's clear, and everywhere I look is clear. So it feels like what we see on a camera. Does that make sense? Yeah, so the inspiration, again, coming from the travel, is an encouragement of trying to capture reality that's maybe a lot more interesting than just a photograph. So it's not just about the detail. So I was talking to some people yesterday up in the gallery, and they were talking about the brushwork in my paintings. And the thing about the brushwork is it immediately says handwork. It's a kind of calligraphy. It says a hand did that, but I'm describing rocks with those hand strokes. So when you look at it, you see hand strokes, but wait, it's a rock, but it's a hand stroke, but it's a rock. And that's what the brain loves to do. Because it can't latch on to one, it constantly works on blending those simple ideas like that. So you'll see people walk up and look, and then they'll step back to look. You see them in museums all the time, like with Sargent. Like, how does that look like fur? And they walk up and they see the strokes, and then they step back, and it comes together again. And the brain really loves that. So that's pretty much, I hope that answered your question. That's pretty much the inspiration. How much story can I get into one painting?
Did you encounter much wildlife?
Wildlife? Yeah. Yeah, no people, just the guys that were fishing that first day from Alabama. And they said, "What are you doing here?" And we said, "What are you doing here?" You know, we said, "We're out in the wilderness. There's not supposed to be anybody here." But no, we saw a moose. Actually, the thing was, there's a lot of Canadian geese flying south, I guess, in August. So I saw a chevron. You know, they fly in a chevron shape. And one of those went over, and it was gigantic. So I was kind of calculating with my hand the number of birds on one leg. 300 on that leg. So that was a 600 bird chevron going over. And then 2 minutes later, another one. And a couple minutes later, another one. And they did that all afternoon. Thousands upon thousands of Canadian geese were going over. I couldn't stop counting them. It was crazy. So that was pretty fascinating. You know, we heard coyote, we heard wolves. We didn't get to see those guys. They're pretty stealthy. Eagles all over the place, fish leaping. I mean, it was sort of like going back to the 1600s up there because of so much wildlife around. Moose. We saw a lot of river otters that were following us a lot. And 1:30 at night, and I poked my head out of the tent just to see if I could see any of the wolves walking around the camp, which probably wasn't a good idea, but I noticed the aurora borealis was out. And I stepped outside to look up. I don't know, has anybody seen that? Just one or two people. In Canada, it was crystal clear, and I just started screaming. I got the whole camp up. Everybody, we were all dancing. Look at you can't imagine what it looks like. It's like lasers cutting through smoke. You know, there's a level of the smoke, and it comes down to the atmosphere and it levels out, and that's what we see. We see that spiraling. But we always see those shots, and it looks like it's so calm and just restful, and it just hangs in the air. It doesn't. It shoots back and forth, really wild and crazy, and it's just the most amazing light show you've ever seen. And the guys back in the 17 and 1800s used to think that it made noise. So they perpetuated, I think, a myth that the aurora borealis has a soundtrack, basically. But I don't think it does, and my research says that that's not true. But they felt that they could hear it. So, of course, the stars up there are amazing. You can see the Milky Way. It's incredible. That's also inspiration for my work. When you experience things like that through travel, that stays with you a lot.
I believe you mentioned you went to art school.
Yeah.
Where did you go?
Minneapolis College of Art and Design. I'm proud to say they were lousy in 1973. Actually, they have embraced illustration at this point. They don't know my work, and they can't find me. They didn't do a Google search, I guess, but no, in 73, the big thing in the art schools was conceptual art, and they thought that was where it was all heading, and why should we paint and draw anymore? And they just didn't know they were going to run into guys like me who were like, yeah, but no, I want to learn how to draw and paint. Well, it's going out of style. Yeah, I don't care. I'm out of style. I don't know. So, yeah.
What inspired you to get into the 1930s type genre with the polar bears?
Oh, upstairs,
Yeah.
that show?
Yeah.
When I was a kid, I always loved biplanes. I love flying things. I grew up about 45 minutes south of Dayton, Ohio, birthplace of aviation, and they had the Air Force Museum up there that still is phenomenal. And they had all different kinds of flying machines, and I was captivated by that. And that, to me, right away, was adventure. And when it came to, I actually did a video of how I paint with a company back in 2009, and I was talking to my friend Irene Gallo, who's an art director at Tor Books. I said, in 24 hours, the film crew is going to show up, and I have no idea what I'm going to paint. And she said, well, you like to paint snow. Why don't you do a guy riding a polar bear? And I thought, that was dumb. And then I thought, wait, she's got a point. Maybe not riding the polar bear. Maybe polar bear pack animals. So that came directly from this trip. I couldn't get canoes in it, but I thought, okay, so pack animals. I did that one painting, and the entire show and the book came from that painting, which is upstairs right now. People wanted to know, what the heck is up with that guy and the polar bears? So I had to sit down and write it. And when I did, all the adventure stuff, all the travel, all the fun stuff as a kid just came out because no one said I couldn't do that. Minneapolis College of Art and Design was not telling me I couldn't do that anymore. So all that came out. And I managed to indulge my love of that, the early 1900s, say about World War I stuff. Mostly because, too, I was restricting the characters to not have as much equipment like we have today. Didn't want to make it easy, and it wasn't easy back then. And any equipment they did have was cumbersome and large, and you know, it was steam-powered, sorta, maybe not. I threw that in. That's about the level of technology. Anyway, at that point, the visuals got to be really fun, so I could go anywhere I wanted with them.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. I like that. Yeah.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks. Yeah. Has everyone seen the show upstairs yet? I encourage you to go see it because I think you'll get a charge out of it. And what the heck, if you don't love polar bears, I mean. And no, they don't talk, they don't wear armor, and they are still wild polar bears. Thank you so much.